Peñasco, New Mexico. Population, 312 people. In 2023, a man named Craig Quancello, the elected governor of one of the smallest federally recognized tribes in the United States, sat across from a scientist from Copenhagen and made a decision that would take 3 years to fully land. He agreed to let that scientist extract DNA from the bones of his ancestors, not because he needed proof of who he was. His people had always known. They'd been saying it for generations, that the Great Canyon to the west, with its massive stone buildings and its roads that stretched to the horizon, was theirs, that the people who built it were their people, that the blood ran continuous. The outside world didn't believe them. So Craig Quancello said yes, not to science, to strategy. The scientist sitting across from him was Dr. S.K. Villerslev, one of the most respected ancient DNA researchers alive, based at the University of Copenhagen. And Villerslev later said something that tells you everything about how unusual this moment was. He said, "This was the first time I've ever experienced a federally recognized community reaching out to understand their ancestry with the help of genetics. The first time in the entire history of this field." Think about that for a second. The agreement they built together was unlike anything in American science. The tribe controlled how the research was conducted. They controlled how the results were presented. Any researcher wanting to access the genome data afterward had to get explicit permission from the tribal council, reviewed every 3 months. Craig Quancello didn't just participate in this study, his name is on it. As a co-author, in Nature, he described the DNA not as proof, but as a tool, his word. We must ensure that tools like ancient DNA serve our communities rather than be used against us. That one sentence is the whole story. Because Chaco Canyon, the place his people call home in their oral histories, the place 275 kilometers to the west, is a UNESCO World Heritage Site managed by the U.S. federal government. More than 24 tribes have claimed connection to it. Picuris Pueblo's voice had been, in the study's own language, minimized in those discussions. Centuries of colonial rule had created gaps in their recorded oral history. Gaps that the institutions making land decisions used as reasons not to listen. The DNA was for closing those gaps, in a language the institutions could not ignore. If you've ever wondered where you really come from, and I mean really, subscribe now. Because what this study found is only the beginning of what this video is going to show you. A population that science had quietly categorized as vanished has been living 275 kilometers from their ancestral city for 1,000 years. Someone built the story of their disappearance. And that story, right now, today, still has legal consequences for living people. The question of who built it starts right now. Before we go further, I want to hear from you. Drop your country or region in the comments below. Seriously, by the end of this video, I'm going to show you why the story of what happened here is not just a Southwest American mystery. It connects to something every single one of us carries. Comment it below. I read everyone. That story has an author. His name is Lieutenant James H. Simpson, August 1849. Simpson rides into Chaco Canyon with a U.S. Army survey party. He is the first American government official to formally document what he finds there. The massive stone ruins, the scale of the buildings, the precision of the construction. And he does not ask the Pueblo communities who have been living 200 miles to the south. Communities that have been saying, "Those are our ancestors' homes," for as long as anyone can remember. He doesn't ask. He decides. He writes in his expedition report, published in 1850, "A vanished race." 2 words, that's it. That is the founding document of the myth this entire video exists to dismantle. Those 2 words spread. They moved through the Smithsonian Institution, through the American Museum of Natural History, through the early literature of what would become the National Park Service. By 1910, the Anasazi were locked in the academic record as a lost civilization. No living descendants, no surviving lineage, no one left to ask. The Hopi, the Zuni, the Rio Grande Pueblo communities, all of them publicly asserting descent from the Chaco people throughout this entire period, were simply not included in the story being told. That exclusion happened 115 years ago. The consequences of it are still being argued in federal court right now, and here is the part that very few people know. The word Anasazi, the name that ended up in every textbook, on every park sign, in every documentary, is a Navajo word, Anasazi. In most translations, it means enemy ancestors, or ancient enemies. The Navajo considered the Chacoans adversaries. And the archaeologists of the early 20th century borrowed that word, their enemy's word, to name them. The actual descendants, the Pueblo peoples who regarded those ancestors with reverence and ceremony, were being identified in the academic record by an insult from a competing group. That name stuck for a century. Between 1896 and 1900, the American Museum of Natural History excavated Pueblo Bonito and removed over 100,000 artifacts, turquoise, shell jewelry, wooden ceremonial objects, and human remains, and shipped them to New York in crates. The Antiquities Act, which would have required permits for that kind of excavation, wasn't passed until 1906. So the removal was entirely legal. For 100 years, those objects sat in storage in Manhattan, while the people who said those are our ancestors were told there was no evidence of a connection. Hold on to those New York crates, because in a later segment, they're going to become the exact reason why a completed DNA study was never published. But first, drought, violence, internal collapse. Those are the explanations every textbook reached for when trying to explain why Chaco went silent. And the DNA has now tested all three of them against the actual genomic record. One of them gets exonerated. And what takes its place is a much more uncomfortable question. Exonerating the drought means something else caused this. And the bones in room 33 have been trying to tell us what for 30 years. Pueblo Bonito, Chaco Canyon. Room 33 is not the largest room in the Great House. It's not the most decorated. It's a small chamber, sealed beneath the floor in the northwest corner of the building. When archaeologists first excavated it in 1896, they found 14 individuals buried with more turquoise than had been found anywhere else in the American Southwest. Hundreds of thousands of pieces. The burial was so deliberate, so layered, so intentional, that the researchers who dug it understood immediately. This was a ruling family, not priests, not warriors, a dynasty. What they didn't understand for another 121 years was what kind of dynasty. Dr. Douglas Kennett spent years on this specific question at the University of California, Santa Barbara. In 2017, his team published something that very few people in his field expected to see. Using radiocarbon dating combined with ancient DNA analysis, they proved that every single individual buried in room 33, across at least 9 separate burials spanning more than 3 centuries, shared the same mitochondrial DNA haplogroup, the same maternal line, passed mother to daughter to daughter to daughter for over 330 years. One woman started this dynasty, and her bloodline governed Chaco Canyon continuously from roughly 800 CE to 1130 CE. And yet, the data said the exact opposite of what the architecture suggested. This was not a warrior class, not a council of elders. It was a maternal bloodline, in a building that size, at that altitude, in that desert. A single family of women, passing power forward through 3 centuries of uninterrupted rule. One of the most elaborately buried individuals in that room, now called Burial 14, was interred with 11,000 pieces of turquoise, shell jewelry, and wooden ceremonial objects. He was not buried like a regional leader. He was buried like a king who expected to be remembered, and the woman whose bloodline he carried had been dead for 250 years when he was placed beside her. He was buried back into the lineage, into the dynasty, into the room. Now here's where it gets specific. The 2025 Picuris study, the one Craig Quancello co-authored, took this even further. Among the 13 living Picuris Pueblo members who gave saliva samples in 2023, one individual carries a haplogroup called B2Y1. It's extremely rare. It appears in very few populations worldwide, and it is the exact same rare mitochondrial haplotype found in the room 33 burials at Pueblo Bonito. Not a similar haplogroup, not a related branch, the identical rare haplotype in a living person. Right now, in northern New Mexico. The dynasty is not extinct. It walked south, But here's the part that breaks the textbook timeline wide open. The Room 33 dynasty ends abruptly around 1130 CE. No more royal burials, no more turquoise. Major construction at Pueblo Bonito stops. And the Great Drought, the one that every documentary, every Wikipedia article, every school textbook credits as the cause of Chaco's collapse, doesn't begin until 1276 CE. That is 146 years after the dynasty was already gone. The textbooks have the sequence of events backwards. If the timeline is backwards, then the thing that actually broke Chaco, whatever happened between 1100 and 1150 CE, has been hiding in plain sight inside the foundation of the city itself. Chaco Canyon, around 1050 CE. At its peak, Pueblo Bonito had 650 rooms and rose 5 stories. It was the largest building in North America for the next 600 years. The canyon's permanent population was perhaps 2,000 people. But the roads, engineered perfectly straight roads, cut into the desert floor, built without wheels and without horses, radiated outward for 400 miles in every direction, connecting more than 150 communities across an area larger than modern England. Chaco was not a city. It was a command center. And there are 3 things the strontium isotope analysis of Chacoan bones revealed. The third one is the one that changes everything about what this city actually was. Strontium isotopes work like this. The minerals in the soil where you grow up get written into your teeth during childhood. Different regions have different strontium signatures. So when scientists tested the teeth of the people buried inside Pueblo Bonito, they found that a significant portion of the canyon's permanent population did not grow up there. Their signatures matched distant corners of the Four Corners region, the Chusca Mountains, the San Juan Basin, communities up to 150 kilometers away. Chaco pulled people in from across the plateau. The strontium data can't tell us if they came willingly, but the massacre evidence 30 years before the city's peak can, Sacred Ridge near Durango, Colorado. Approximately 800 CE, archaeologists Jason Chwipka and James Potter excavated a site and recovered 14,882 human skeletal fragments from approximately 33 individuals. The bones show percussion fractures, cut marks consistent with deliberate defleshing, and burned residue. 2-headed axes at the site tested positive for human blood. Ankle bones were broken by blunt force trauma before death. In the words of Chwipka himself, it was entirely an inside job. This was not a war between outsiders. It was the violent elimination of one group by another group from within the same cultural sphere, and the timing places it right at the beginning of Chaco's rise to power. The matrilineal bloodline that took up residence in Room 33 shortly after this event may have been the lineage that survived that violence and institutionalized it as divine right. Actually, if you watched our last video, you already saw the first thread of this pattern. What did you think? Did it change how you see population collapse in the ancient world? Tell me in the comments. Because what's coming in the next few segments is exactly where that earlier story was pointing. But here's where it gets strange, because the DNA that confirmed all of this also found something nobody expected. There is no evidence of population decline in the Picuris genome before European arrival. None. Meaning the crash everyone assumed happened in the ancient world wasn't ancient at all. The 33 individuals from Sacred Ridge have never been genetically identified. Their haplogroup data has never been published. The DNA technically exists in the extracted bone record. The study that would have connected them to the Chacoan founding population has not been completed. The identities of both the victims and the perpetrators still unsequenced, still waiting, no decline. That's what the genome says. But the tree rings say something collapsed. So which one is lying? The tree rings do not lie. Dendrochronological data collected from ancient timber beams across the Four Corners region, a method first developed by astronomer Andrew Ellicott Douglas at the University of Arizona in 1901 and refined across a century of research, confirms it with millimetric precision. From 1276 to 1299 CE, the American Southwest experienced one of the most severe droughts in 2,000 years. Agricultural output collapsed. The corn failed year after year. The springs dried. By 1300 CE, Chaco was empty. Mesa Verde was empty. Every great house in the region stood silent. Here is your answer. Simple, environmental, closed. And yet, the genome data says the exact opposite of what that narrative requires. Dr. Thomas Pinotti led the genomic analysis at the University of Copenhagen. His team tested specifically for pre-colonial population decline using 3 independent demographic methods. The results were not ambiguous. There is no evidence of population decline in the Picuris genome before European arrival. None. The population size estimates, ranging from roughly 3,000 to 10,000 individuals in the broader Picuris sphere of influence around 1300 to 1350 CE, are consistent with a community that was not collapsing, a community that was thriving. The Chacoan descendants walked south. They rebuilt. They maintained their governance, their ritual knowledge, their oral memory, and they were healthy. The false conclusion fully collapses here. The drought is real. The drought contributed. But calling the drought the cause of the Anasazi disappearance is like blaming a flood for the collapse of a dam that was already cracking. And here is what actually caused the crack. By 1700 CE, Picuris Pueblo had been reduced to approximately 300 people, down from an estimated 3,000 at the time of European contact in less than 200 years. That is an 85% reduction. Not from ancient drought, not from internal collapse, from smallpox, from forced labor, from the violence of colonial contact and the Pueblo Revolt of 1680. This isn't just ancient history. The descendants of the most powerful civilization in pre-Columbian North America were reduced to 300 people by the colonial world, not the ancient one, and their genome carries the record of both. The demographic collapse of the colonial period, from 3,000 to 300 in 2 centuries, is the event that created the gaps in oral history, the lost ritual knowledge, the missing intergenerational transmission of memory. And those gaps are what the institutions later pointed to when they said, insufficient evidence of cultural affiliation. The evidence was destroyed by the same system now requiring it. If the Chacoans walked south intact and were thriving at contact, then the 146-year corridor between 1150 and 1300 CE, the gap between Chaco's end and the earliest Picuris carbon dates, is not empty. It is a populated, unsequenced stretch of human history. What happened during that walk is the most important story that ancient DNA has not yet told. The corridor runs 275 kilometers south. At one end, the ruins of Pueblo Bonito. At the other, a living nation of 300 people who just proved in a nature study that they are the same family. April 30th, 2025. Nature, volume 642. The study opens with a sentence that the scientific community had been building towards since 1896. We show genetic continuity between ancient and present-day Picuris, and more broadly, with ancestral Puebloans from Pueblo Bonito in Chaco Canyon, 275 kilometers to the west. That's the academic version. Here is what it means in plain language. The people called vanished are enrolled members of a federally recognized tribe. Some of them gave saliva samples 2 years ago. One of them carries the same rare haplogroup as the ruling dynasty buried in room 33. The lead researcher on the genomic analysis was Dr. J. Victor Moreno-Meyer at the University of Copenhagen. His team compared Picuris genomes against 300 populations from across the Americas and more than 5,500 individuals worldwide. Every statistical method they used returned the same result. His conclusion, stated plainly, no other sampled population, ancient or present day, is more closely related to ancestral Puebloans from Pueblo Bonito than the Picuris individuals are. No other population, ancient or modern, anywhere. What they found next changed everything we thought we knew, not just about the Anasazi, but about what DNA is even capable of proving in a federal legal context. The specific marker at the center of this confirmation is haplogroup B2Y1. It is a very rare mitochondrial haplotype. It appears in very few populations or individuals worldwide. And it is now confirmed in 2 places. Inside the room 33 burials at Pueblo Bonito, the ruling dynasty that governed Chaco for 330 years, and in a living enrolled member of Picuris Pueblo who gave a saliva sample in 2023. The dynasty did not go extinct, it changed addresses. Craig Quancello did not frame the publication as a victory, he framed it as a tool. He said the DNA study reinforces our legal claims while preserving cultural heritage. He said legal claims. The genome was never just a history lesson, it was evidence, entered into the record. In a language the institutions were required by law to take seriously. There is one more name that belongs in this story: Richard Mermejo, former governor of Picuris Pueblo, war chief, Kiva leader, and the tribal liaison who made the research collaboration possible in the first place, passed away on January 27, 2024. He did not live to see the paper published. His name appears in the acknowledgments of one of the most significant studies in this field in decades. He never knew he would be there. Now here is the part that does not simplify. The study explicitly states that it does not challenge the connections that more than 24 other federally recognized tribes have to Chaco Canyon. But it also states, clearly, that this is the only example of paleogenomic data supporting a federally recognized tribe's affiliation with Chaco Canyon ancestors. One tribe, confirmed. 23 others, with oral traditions just as ancient and just as specific, still waiting. And then there is this. The Southern Athabascan peoples, the Navajo and Apache, the group whose name for the ancestral Puebloans became the academic label for the vanished race, were long hypothesized to have arrived in the Southwest as early as 800 CE. The 2025 study tested this directly. It found zero evidence of Athabascan ancestry in any ancient Picuris individual before 1535 CE. The Navajo arrived after the Spanish. The colonizers and the namers arrived together, and that changes everything about who the disappearance story was built to serve. It served institutions, and those institutions in 2025 have still not updated. Washington, D.C., the year 2000. The American Museum of Natural History conducts a federally mandated review under NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, passed in 1990, to determine which communities have cultural affiliation with the Pueblo Bonito remains in their collection. The remains that were crated up and shipped to New York a century earlier. The review concludes, insufficient evidence of affiliation. The bones stay, the turquoise stays. The vanished race framing, it turns out, has a legal function. If they vanished, if there are no living heirs, no one can make a claim. The disappearance myth was not just romantic archaeology, it was a property framework. But here's where it gets strange, because the case for institutional good faith is actually stronger than you'd expect, and it still falls apart. The opposing argument, stated fairly, academic institutions acted cautiously because the evidence was genuinely unclear. NAGPRA processes required documented evidence. The genomics technology needed to produce definitive results didn't exist until very recently. The 2017 Kennett study and the 2025 Pinati study used methods that simply were not available in 2000. That is true. This is also true. The system was designed so that the burden of proof rested entirely on the people whose ancestors were taken, not on the institutions that took them. In 2020, the University of Colorado returned 98 ancestral Puebloan individuals to a consortium of 24 tribes. Not because DNA confirmed anything, because the university recategorized the remains under updated federal guidance and agreed to tribal reburial requests. Those remains were reburied in the Four Corners region. No DNA was extracted beforehand. The genomic data that could have confirmed, or complicated, the 2025 findings is permanently gone. 98 ancient individuals' complete genetic history, inaccessible forever, because the institutions could not design a process that honored both sovereignty and science at the same time. Hold on to that, because in 2014, a team at a major institution completed a genome sequencing study of Chaco Canyon remains. And then it disappeared. Not retracted, not published, just stopped. Researchers with knowledge of the project have described a combination of institutional caution, concerns about tribal consent frameworks, and the absence of a collaborative structure that would have made publication ethically defensible. The data exists somewhere on a server. The paper does not exist anywhere. What it would have shown and whose legal position it would have supported, is unknown. The Picuris 2025 study may have already answered that question, or it may have answered it differently. No one outside the original team knows, and that team has not spoken publicly. The paper does not exist. But the genomes that were published, the Picuris genomes, contain something no one expected to find. Something that isn't about land rights or legal standing. Something written into the biology of survival itself. She has no name. She is identified in the study as one of the ancient Picuris women whose genome was sequenced at high enough coverage to read her ancestry in detail. She carries mitochondrial haplogroup B2Y1. She is buried at Picuris Pueblo, sometime between 1350 and 1450 CE. She is the thread. Everything the 2025 study proved about the continuity of the Chaco bloodline, it proved in part through her. And her genome contains something else, a scar. Population geneticists call it a bottleneck, a moment in a group's history where the population drops so severely that genetic diversity is compressed. The survivors rebuild, but the compression leaves a signature in the genome that researchers can read centuries later, the way you can see drought in a tree ring. The Picuris' ancient genomes show exactly that signal, a dramatic reduction in genetic diversity, a crash, and then a recovery. The timing of that bottleneck, estimated from patterns in the ancient genome data, is consistent with the colonial period, specifically with the catastrophic losses following Spanish contact in the 16th and 17th centuries. Not the Chaco collapse, not the 12th century, the 16th. This is the finding that reframes everything that came before it. The Chacoans who walked south were not a shattered remnant. They arrived at their new home with their governance intact, their population healthy, their maternal bloodline unbroken. The near extinction came later. It came on horseback. But the bottleneck left more than a demographic scar. The Picuris' ancient genomes show HLA diversity patterns. That's the architecture of the immune system, consistent with a founding population that passed through extreme demographic stress. The specific pathogen or stressor that caused the crash at Picuris is not identifiable from the genomes alone, but the crash itself is written into every cell of every person who descends from those survivors. It is biological memory. You cannot read it in a document or hear it in a story. You have to sequence it. Dr. Pinotti's team at Copenhagen estimated the effective population size in Picuris before European arrival at somewhere between 3,000 and 10,000 individuals. After 2 centuries of colonial contact, that number fell to 300. The community Craig Quancello governs today is not a remnant of Chaco Canyon. It is Chaco Canyon's continuation, compressed, carrying scar tissue in its genome that a machine in Denmark can now read and a federal agency in Washington has yet to formally act on. The HLA immune architecture reduction isn't just a biological footnote. When epidemic disease arrived with the Spanish in the 1500s, communities that had already passed through prior demographic stress, already immunologically narrowed, were disproportionately exposed. The colonial collapse and whatever biological pressure preceded it may be connected in the genome in ways that researchers have not yet fully mapped. The 12th century and the 16th century may share a signal, and that signal is still being read. The corridor between Chaco's end and Picuris' beginning is 275 kilometers and 150 years, and it contains almost nothing. No published genomes, no burials with reliable carbon dates that fall cleanly inside that window, no names, no record of the people who were walking. The carbon date sequence at Picuris Pueblo begins confidently in the 1300s CE. The carbon date sequence at Chaco Canyon effectively ends in the mid-11th century. Between them is a stretch of southwestern history that the archaeological record cannot populate, not because it was empty, but because the methodology requires bones in the ground to function. And the people walking south were not leaving bones in the ground in ways that modern excavation has found. The survival, the most important event in this entire story, is the one event the DNA cannot describe, not because it didn't happen, because no one has found the evidence of people in motion. Now consider this parallel. It is not a coincidence, it is a pattern. Around 1431 CE, the Khmer Empire evacuated Angkor. then the largest city on Earth, home to an estimated 1 million people. Within 50 years, the city was depopulated. For roughly 150 years, there was almost no skeletal record of the Khmer population. The city was physically there, the roads were there, the temples were there, the people were not in the archaeological record. Western researchers declared it a mystery, a collapse, a vanishing. Then, genomic data placed their descendants in present-day Cambodia and Thailand, genetically continuous, linguistically continuous, carrying oral histories of the migration that no outside researcher had credited for a century. 2 collapses, 2 migrations, 2 150-year silences in the physical record, both resolved by living descendants who never forgot where they came from. This is not a coincidence. It is a pattern in how archaeology has historically treated civilizations whose written record does not survive in a European language. The silence in the physical record gets interpreted as absence, rather than as a limitation of the tools being used. Those are different problems. One belongs to the ancient world, the other belongs to the archaeologists. Alfonso Ortiz understood this. He was a San Juan Pueblo anthropologist, the first Native American to receive a PhD in anthropology from the University of Chicago. In 1972, he published The Tiwa World, documenting Pueblo origin stories that explicitly trace descent from Chaco-era communities. His work was available. It was in print. It was not invisible. It was simply not consulted in most archaeogenomics papers on ancestral Puebloans published before 2020. The 2025 Picuris study closes one gap, but it also maps the shape of a much larger silence for the 23 other federally recognized tribes with claimed affiliation to Chaco Canyon. There is no equivalent genomic study, not because their connections are weaker, because none of them have had the resources, the institutional partnerships, or the legal incentives that Picuris had. The DNA technology that confirmed Picuris's connection has existed since 2017. The other confirmations are sitting in a waiting room that nobody has funded. The 150 years of missing genetic record between Chaco's collapse and Picuris's founding is not a gap in human history. It is a gap in the record of a methodology that requires the dead to speak before it will listen to the living. The Picuris people were alive during those 150 years. They were walking, they were mourning, they were carrying seeds and memory and the maternal bloodline of a dynasty that had governed a 5-story stone building in the desert for 3 centuries. The absence is not theirs. It belongs to the science. In April 2025, the month the Nature paper was published, the federal government was still processing land use decisions around Chaco Canyon based on consultation frameworks that predate the genomic evidence now in the record. The study exists. The confirmation exists. Craig Quancello's name is on it, in a journal that every federal archaeologist in the country reads. And the legal machinery that governs who has standing at Chaco Canyon, who gets consulted, whose objections carry weight, whose cultural affiliation is recognized, has not been formally updated to reflect what that paper found. This is not a conspiracy. It is slower and more ordinary than that. It is the institutional pace of a system that was not designed to move quickly when the correction benefits indigenous communities. There's something else the study found that almost no coverage of it mentioned. The genomic data confirmed that the Picuris people carry ancestry from multiple ancestral Puebloan groups, not just Chaco, but communities across the broader Four Corners region. Their genome is a record of convergence, of communities coming together over centuries, of a people that was not one discrete group, but many groups finding each other after the collapse. The oral traditions that describe migration and gathering, traditions that were used for a century as evidence that the Pueblo peoples were not the original Chacoans because they came from different places, turn out to describe exactly what the genome shows. Multiple origins, continuous identity, a people who built themselves from pieces after something catastrophic. And the most destabilizing finding of all is not the confirmation of the Chaco connection. It is this. The effective population size of the pre-contact Picuris community, estimated at 3,000 to 10,000 people, means that at the time, the vanished race narrative was being written. At the time, Lieutenant Simpson was riding through Chaco Canyon, calling them extinct. At the time, the American Museum of Natural History was crating up their ancestors' bones. The Picuris Pueblo community was already there. already living in northern New Mexico, already governing themselves, already practicing the religion, already telling the stories, already saying they were connected to Chaco. They were not hard to find. Nobody was looking. If you want to know what happened to the people science called vanished, subscribe, because the next video goes somewhere this one can't. There is a child alive today in Picuris Pueblo who carries haplogroup B2Y1. A woman was buried with that same marker in room 33 at Pueblo Bonito in 1130 CE, 895 years of unbroken maternal inheritance. In a community that 3 separate federal reviews described as having insufficient evidence of cultural affiliation with the place their ancestor ruled. The DNA proved they never disappeared. The question that has no clean answer is why. For 150 years, nobody wanted to know that.